Welcome to Honest Straightforward Reviews. I have been very busy and taking a really long time to bring you an honest and solid complete review of the M1 chip that Apple has produced. Please do check out my video till the end to completely appreciate what my findings are. Without further ado, let's get this underway. The Intel chip recently got underpowered by Apple in its Macs. What I mean by this is that I discovered that after a macOS Catalina update at the start of the year, the Intel based chips are quite power limited. This is true even with the new iMac 2020. I will have a review linked at the end of this video of that computer and in the comment section. What I found was the i9 processor in the iMac got a lot less power to it even when compared to the i7, and the difference was about 15 watts. As you could appreciate, the i9 would actually need more power than the i7 to operate properly and reach its full capacity. By underpowering the Intel Macs just before the M1 release, Apple has ensured that they don't look as good as the M1 chip, and the performance difference between the M1 and the Intel chips would be huge. Around also the same time, around the middle of this year to the start of this year, 2020 I'm talking about, a Final Cut Pro X update took out the use of GPUs when exporting a HEVC file. HEVC files are the most commonly used file by YouTubers, and YouTubers are who make a lot of noise about the M1 chip. This means that the Intel Macs are only using the CPU to export HEVC file, while the M1 Macs use both the CPU, GPU and RAMs, giving them an unfair advantage. This disadvantage can be taken out when you are exporting to H.264, or if you're using another app like DaVinci Resolve to do your exports for both of them. What I found was the Intel based Macs use both the CPU and GPU just like their M1 counterpart. I have a full test of this and will include that in the comments below as well. Please do watch that, as I have put a lot of work in that as well. In those tests, you'll see that the Intel Macs are beating the M1 Macs by quite a margin. Just so to double check and triple check my results, I used DaVinci Resolve both on an M1 Mac Mini with upgraded 16 gig of RAMs, which is the maximum performance improvement you can get, and an Intel iMac i9 with a 5700 XT. Yes, given they're completely different class of computers, but I just wanted to see what most YouTubers were claiming. They were claiming that you should sell your Mac Pro even, which costs over $10,000. You should sell that and get an M1 Mac Mini. So I just wanted to check that. The findings that I found were quite interesting, as the M1 Mac Mini with the extra $300 16 gig RAM upgrade exported the same project in 8 minutes in DaVinci Resolve, while the iMac took just 6 minutes. Now, I'm not saying this is an apples to apples comparison, and no pun intended. As I mentioned before, yes, the iMac is a different class of product which costs a lot more, especially when you're comparing it to the M1 Mac Mini. But a lot of YouTubers claimed that Apple has just found the holy grail, the cradle of life, the eighth wonder of the world, the advancement in technology. Don't get me wrong, Apple has done a fantastic job with the M1, offering great battery life, cool operation and optimization. But it is another thing to tell everyone to sell all your Macs, all the Intel ones. Forget Intel. Intel is finished and M1 does everything so much better. In my tests, even when I was comparing the M1 to the M1 MacBook Pro to my MacBook Pro 16-inch, again, different class, I understand, but a lot of people were saying you should even get rid of that. So when I was comparing it to that, and my MacBook Pro 16-inch only has the 5500M with the 4 gigs of, not the 56, not the 8 gig one, just 4 gig VRAM version. When I was checking it, under a lot of stress, I just had Final Cut open on both. Final Cut, by the way, is optimized more for the M1 now than the Intel Mac. Even then, when I was scrubbing through my project and looking at things, the M1 was struggling. It did drop frames and stutter, whereas the MacBook Pro 16-inch didn't. And on top of that, you got to understand, my M1 Mac was just a test laptop, just a test desktop. They haven't been used a lot. I just set them up, put Final Cut, did my testing. There was no other apps running in the backgrounds. There's no apps installed. Whereas my MacBook Pro 16-inch is my everyday computer. I do everything on it. So it's got a lot of apps, a lot of things running in the background, and it's only got 16 gigs of RAM. It still beat it. I have done a lot of testing, and hence I took my time doing this review. So kindly stay with me. I know it's getting a bit lengthy to not only understand what I'm saying, but also what I'm going to be recommending. Secondly, it is no secret that the M1 chips are massively optimized to macOS. My point is, why not massively optimize it to Intel chips as well? In the end of the day, when a customer buys an Apple product, they're not buying a product and building themselves a computer like a PC, but rather they're buying an experience. Just like Apple claims, Apple owes it to their customers to provide them the best optimized system. Doesn't matter Intel or M1, Apple chose to put Intel chips in there and sold it just 6 months ago. They should let the i9 in the iMac perform to its maximum, and they should have chucked in a couple of fans. I mean, my God, iMac Pro has 2 fans on it. The iMac has 1 fan, so it's better cool. It's just a fan, guys. It doesn't cost a lot, and especially after moving the iMac 2019 to the iMac 2020 to a SSD, there's a lot of space in there for another fan. So they didn't do that. So they're doing a lot of these little things to handicap Intel. Another great thing about the M1 chips, they can run iOS and iPadOS apps natively without any hiccups most of the time. It is a little buggy and apps can't be used in full screen or have their orientation changed from portrait to landscape. On top of that, a lot of app developers are to date holding off and polishing their apps to work and behave with the M1 chip. There are ways to install apps that are not available on the M1 Max, but you need to be very careful with that. So, and I would highly advise not to do that. However, if you do not use your account to log in. For example, what I mean by that is I installed PUBG Mobile on my M1 MacBook Pro and logged in with my account of PUBG Mobile, which I was using for 3 years, and I had 3 years worth of gaming on their products and things like that I purchased, and a lot of things out there. I had a clan and things like that if you play PUBG, so I had a lot of time invested. Immediately I got banned for 10 years from my account. I've tried everything to get it unbanned, however it is not possible. So be careful with that. The M1 chips are super power efficient. It nearly adds 30% in my experience of battery life when you compare it to an Intel counterpart. That is great, but it's not what YouTubers are advertising. They're saying that you get over 3 days on a single charge, which is true if you check your emails and browse the net. But if you're doing editing or anything other than that uses and just pushes that M1 chip a bit harder, then your battery is not going to last. In essence, if your battery lasts 3 hours on the Intel based Macs while doing heavy tasks, it'll last 4 hours. That's the only difference. The M1 chips are powerful as well when you compare it to the right Intel Mac. For instance, comparing the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch to my Intel MacBook Pro 13-inch with an i7, 2.3 GHz and 32 gigs of RAM, completely spec'd up to the highest, costing me around $5,000, the M1 MacBook Pro does win, okay? And it costs a lot less, which is not what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that a lot of people are claiming that it's better than a Mac Pro. Existing Apple apps run like a breeze on the M1. However, Intel-based apps do run a million times better on their Intel version. For instance, the same project that I exported with DaVinci Resolve took me over 3 hours to export on Adobe Premiere using the M1 chip. Because it's not optimized yet and things like that, it was using Rosetta and doing all that behind. So just take that with a grain of salt. Yes, it's optimized for Final Cut and things like that. It's not optimized for other stuff. It might be, it might not be. I think it would be, but hey, in my experience, if you want a Mac, use Apple stuff. If you want to use Adobe Premiere, save yourself a lot of money and go use a PC. Another fact is that being the first generation of its type, you will be beta testing the computer and a lot of the apps that are non-Apple. Your experience might be really bad if you're especially using apps like Adobe Premiere. The M1 Macs also run very cool. So cool that the maximum temperature that I saw my fanless MacBook Air reach was around 70 degrees before it got throttled a little bit. What that means is that you get a computer that is highly efficient, not only on battery, because it's not using a lot of power to run its fans to keep itself cool, but also very quiet as well. The Intel Macs would run to 95, even 100 degrees, and then they would throttle massively and get really loud and just take a chunk out of your battery. For instance, the i9 in my MacBook Pro 16-inch, which is a lot better cooled than the 15-inch design, is designed to use up to to 125 watts just by itself, not taking into account the computer screen, the GPU, the RAM, the logic board, the SSD, and all that stuff. Just the processor is designed to turbo and use up to 125 watts, which is, as you would know, a lot more than the 96 watt that my charger is giving it, meaning that every time it does that, it chews into the battery and charger together to be able to sustain that, and then it throttles down. And another good thing about the M1 chips are the inclusion of Wi-Fi 6, which is a very nice feature to see. Not only does this mean that you get a very stable Wi-Fi connection, but also it means your Mac is future-proof for years to come. Having the updated scissor keyboard not only brings reliability, but also brings longevity, as the outgoing butterfly keyboard were useless and had a lot of issues. I've got a MacBook from back in the day, 2016. It's got a problem with its escape key. I've had it replaced twice. I've just given up. It's useless to even bother with Apple in regards to that. With the brand new M1 Max, we see a reduction in prices for most of the lineups and the best performance increase in regards to that. For example, what I mean by that is if you compare the MacBook Air M1 to the MacBook Air Intel one, the M1 MacBook Air not only would beat it at efficiency, but also at performance. I don't believe this is to be true for the MacBook Pro 16-inch, nor the iMac or above models when you compare the M1 chip to them, even though a lot of YouTubers are claiming so. As discussed earlier, Intel has been massively handicapped. All the M1 Macs also have fewer USB-C ports than the Intel models by 2. They just get 2 ports, USB-C ports, whereas the Intel ones get 4. However, I am not too fussed about this. Yes, it's an inconvenience to only have USB-C ports on one side of your computer, but when I checked, those 2 USB-C ports have 2 buses connected to it, whereas the 4 on the Intel ones have 2 buses. So 1 bus on each side, 2 ports to them. What that means is if you have data hungry devices connected to one side of it, so for example on the left side you've got a eGPU and an SSD card with your games, it'll be splitting that speed in half. So you're better off putting the SSD on the other side and the eGPU on one side, whereas with the other Macs you get those 2. The reason why I use an eGPU that is plugged in by itself on the left side of the port, while I have an SSD plugged into the right side, I use the other port on the right side to use other things that don't need high transfer rates, such as a mouse, mic, and a keyboard. With the introduction of the M1 chip, Apple has completely taken out support for eGPUs. If you have a powerful graphic card with an expensive enclosure, you can kiss that goodbye, as they are no longer supported, and I doubt they would be from here on. This is evident as to date Apple has not included any support for the AMD Radeon 6000 series, even in their macOS Big Sur 11.2 beta. I have installed it, I have checked it out, it's not supported, which is quite sad as the 6000 series has been on the market for 2 months now. Apple has had ample amount of time to get support out for it, and if they're not going to do it, they should at least let their customers go on AMD's website and just download the right drivers to make that graphic card work. I haven't been able to use mine. That's a gripe I have with Apple. The speakers that you get on the MacBook Pro are great. On MacBook Air and Mini, not so great, especially on Mini. Needless to say, are quite awful and useless. If so, what that means for yourself is if you're getting the Mac Mini for bang for buck, you need to fork out for a good pair of speakers. Just keeping that in mind. Even though the board in these Macs are quite smaller because of the M1 chip, you can no longer upgrade the RAMs yourself, which is understandable because the RAMs are part of Apple's unified M1 architecture, but it's still a bummer. On top of that, even though it's smaller, Apple has no design changes. The designs are exactly the same. Apple has failed to reduce the size and weight of these computers, the physical footprint of these computers, yet they even took out the fan fan of the MacBook Air. This is quite lazy on part of Apple, making the Macs look old. It is not hard to get even the 16 gig M1 Mac Mini that I have to start swapping. Swapping is the process by which if a Mac needs more memory than the given 16 gigabyte, for example, in my case, it would use the very fast SSDs to write on and read off and use it as RAM. I have seen the M1 Mac Mini that I have needing more than the 16 gig RAM just for my editing use, having Final Cut running. I have checked this in Activity Monitor. Verdict time. Given how new tech, especially when it comes out to chips, do a performance leap in the first few years, and the fact that Apple only offers 8 gigabytes of RAM as a base and a maximum of 16, I would suggest that if you don't need a Mac, to wait. If you aren't dying to get a Mac, if your Mac is working fine, wait. Imagine in about 10 months when Apple releases the new line of Macs and they introduce the M2 instead of the M1 or something like that, that is over 200% faster than the M1 chip, offers 32 gigs of RAM and gets redesigned, with the Mac Mini being smaller, the Air maybe getting a fan, and the MacBook Pro getting thinner bezels and a bigger screen to 14.1 inch and looking a lot modern. I know I would be kicking myself in 10 months time if that happens, if I bought an M1 Mac for my everyday use, which is very likely to happen. If you do not need a Mac right now, wait and see what happens in the next few years. But it is inevitable that you will need to upgrade to Apple's SoCs in about 4 years' time. Some of the dirty tricks that I found Apple to be using against the Intel Macs have disappointed me to the point that I'm starting to consider shifting to Adobe Premiere and hence using a PC for myself. If you're looking to get a Mac and you need a Mac right now, yes, I would suggest to get the M1 Mac. They're really good, especially if you're going for a Mac Mini, MacBook Air or MacBook Pro. Get the M1 versions. They are so much better than their Intel counterpart. So if you go back and look at my H.264 exports that use both GPU and CPU for both M1 and Intel based, in that, yes, the M1 is nearly 20 seconds faster, and if you've got a 16 gig M1, then it's just 35 seconds to export the same project that was 1 minute and 14 seconds on the 13-inch MacBook Pro. However, when you go to a iMac and when you go to a MacBook Pro 16-inch with the 56 gig, if you've already got them, then they're really good. The gripe I've got is a lot of people on YouTube are going, oh, sell your MacBooks, chuck it out, creating this false hype around the M1. It is great. Apple has done a fantastic job at creating a chip that it runs cool, that runs on low power, and it's quite powerful. Okay, quite powerful in the sense when you pitch it up against the same class, not when you pitch it up against a macro. Alright guys, so if you want to see more videos and support the channel and you like this video, please give me a like, thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Also check out my Twitter, Instagram and Patreon accounts. That helps a lot if you follow them and contribute there. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.